Businesses started recognizing the value of computing and saw its potential to boost profits by improving labor and data-intensive tasks. The first recognized device for computing was the abacus, which essentially is a hand-operated calculator that helps add and subtract many numbers. It also stores the current state of your computation, much like hard drives do today. The abacus was created because the scale of society had become larger than what a single person could keep and manipulate in his mind. After the abacus was invented, it spread to other countries like the Han Empire and the Roman Empire. Soon, it also got more complicated, with the Romans using it to collect taxes. Although there were early computers back then, nobody ever called a device a computer. A computer was a person who did calculations, sometimes with the help of machines. By the end of the 18th century, devices which did calculations were getting more and more popular with the rich, but it took hours to just crank out one number and it was rather inefficient. By the 1800s, the calculator gained a new market, the military. A particularly difficult problem is accurately firing artillery shells, which by the 1800s could travel well over a kilometer. On the consumer side, Charles Babbage proposed a new mechanical device called the difference machine, much like today's calculators. Businesses started recognizing the value of computing and saw its potential to boost profits by improving labor and data-intensive tasks. To meet this demand, Hollerith founded the Tabulating Machine Company, which later merged with other machine makers in 1924 to become the IB. When Charles Babbage was creating the difference engine, Babbage dreamed of a general-purpose computer, what he called an analytical engine. English mathematician Ada Lovelace wrote hypothetical programs for the analytical engine, saying, "A new, a vast, and a powerful language is developed for the future use of analysis." This is why Ada Lovelace is widely recognized as the world's first computer programmer. By the end of the 19th century, computing devices were used for special-purpose tasks in the sciences and engineering, but rarely seen in business, government, or domestic life. However, the U.S. government faced a serious problem for its 1890 census that demanded the kind of efficiency of a computer. To solve this problem, the Census Bureau turned to Herman Hollerith, who had built a tabulating machine. His machine was electromechanical. It used traditional mechanical systems for keeping count, like Leibniz step reckoner, but coupled them with electrically powered components. Hollerith's machine used punch cards, which were paper cards with a grid of locations that can be punched out to represent data. For example, there were a series of holes for marital status. If you were married, you would punch out the married spot. Then when the card was inserted into Hollerith's machine, little metal pins would come down over the card. If a spot was punched out, the pin would pass through a hole in the paper and into a little vial of mercury, which completed the circuit. This now completed circuit powered an electric motor, which turned a gear to add 1, in this case, to the married total. Hollerith's machine was roughly 10 times faster than manual tabulations, and the census was completed in just 2.5 years, saving the census office millions of dollars. Businesses started recognizing the value of computing and saw its potential to boost profits by improving labor and data-intensive tasks. To meet this demand, Hollerith founded the Tabulating Machine Company, which later merged with other machine makers in 1924 to become the IB. Thank you for watching this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. Next episode, Intro to Programming.